One of the things I love about Sydney Writers' Festival is its capacity for eclecticism. Where else would you get to see two of this country's finest intellectuals talk in a session named after a nightly soap opera, Home and Away? I have it on good authority. That's not the subject of today's session, merely the name. Tomorrow night you can catch Bob Ellis and Kate Grenville talking about Desperate Housewives, so stay tuned for that one. But no, today will be a session about culture and about race, about identity and about friendship. And it's partly inspired by a wonderful article that appeared in the April edition of The Monthly this year, those of you who didn't see it. It was called Who's Afraid of Marcia Langton? And so I thought it might be a good way to start by asking for a show of hands. Who's afraid of Marcia Langton? Well, I think after today you'll see that that's either very wise or completely unnecessary. Marcia will be, for those who don't know, Marcia is a Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. She's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia, a member of the board of the Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership, and Chair of Museums and Galleries. Chair of the board for Museums and Galleries of the Northern Territory. In the article in The Monthly, the person writing the article described her as someone who makes you want to read about things you never thought you'd want to read, and also as someone who floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee. Please make her very welcome. The author of that article is our other guest today, and one of Australia's finest, most acclaimed and adored writers, Peter Robb. If you aren't reading Peter Robb's latest book, Street Fight in Naples, at the moment, you need to rush off to the Glee Book store afterwards and make sure you get yourself a copy. Peter will be available to sign it. But he's also the author of Midnight in Sicily, A Death in Brazil. He's an extraordinary writer, and pretty much think of a literary award, he's won it or he deserves to win it. Please welcome Peter Robb. And finally, before I leave the stage, you will get a chance to ask questions of them. So your fear of Marcia notwithstanding, you should think of a question now, because at about 10 past, I'll take to the microphone and you will get a chance to ask a question. Wait for the microphone to come to you, and please keep it brief, because we're here not to hear from me or even from you, but from our two guests today, Marcia Langton and Peter Robb.
I'll ask my thing now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just before Professor Langton and I begin our intimate little conversation, could I ask a small courtesy of those of you present today? I noticed that on the program of the festival we're billed as old friends, and indeed we are. We've been good friends for nearly 40 years, but there's a corollary to that, because good friends don't pull any punches on each other. And Marcia has a little habit which can be revealing, which is jiggling her foot. This is perfectly normal. A lot of us do it. I jiggle my own foot quite often. But I'd be very grateful if anybody notices from the audience that Marcia's foot is jiggling with unusual rapidity and vigour. And if you could just kindly make a little gesture drawing that to my attention, because it means I'm going to be in it for a very tough time in about 2 minutes down the track. So if you could just kindly help me with that, I'd be very grateful. Michael has mentioned that I wrote an article about Marcia just a little while ago, and this was a very fascinating experience for me, because it filled in a few gaps that I hadn't been aware that even existed in my awareness of her life. And one of the things that most fascinated me that we talked about was her time in Asia, which started in the beginning of 1970. And I wanted to ask you about that, Marcia, because Marcia said something very fascinating about the delights of invisibility in Asia. Could you tell us something about why you left and what you found?
Well, of course, I was, like many other people, escaping from Queensland. I think, possibly more than half the people who were born in my year in Queensland don't live in Queensland, and, have been exiled all over the world ever since and can't really return home now. So it was the big escape. And of course, I didn't first go to Asia. First, I went to Melanesia. I went to Papua New Guinea, where I had a wonderful time. It was before independence, so it was still a mandate of Australia. And I'd studied at university with many of the then leaders of the emerging Papua New Guinea polity, and they were extraordinary characters. Then I caught a ship to Japan from Madang, or someplace there on the northern coast of New Guinea, a cattle ship, as I remember. This was back in the day when you could get a £50 fare and travel the high seas, and you'd get a cabin in the officers' quarters. So I ended up at Yokohama Bay, and then lived in Shinjuku back in the Bohemian period, and worked in bars. I worked in television, and became acquainted there with Zen Buddhism. Went down to Kyoto, went to every temple in Kyoto, and back then every university had a dormitory, and at the end of every dormitory was what was called the Strangers' Wing, with tatami flooring, and if you had your own bedding, you could stay for 25 cents a night in the Strangers' Wing in the universities in Japan. And so I stayed in universities and went around rural Japan and visited lots of temples and so on, and began to study haiku and Japanese theatre and so on. Then, of course, I went to Taiwan and Hong Kong and Indonesia, Thailand.
Doing all this at the age of 18 with a child of a few weeks.
Yeah. And Asian people then, of course it was the time of the Vietnam War, were then very curious about Westerners. So you could have wonderful conversations, and you could, stay in villages and go to ceremonies. I spent a whole 2 weeks at one of the longest Ramayana festivals ever held in Bali, back in the day when there were no tourists around. And, of course, Asia was crawling with soldiers of various sorts.
Specifically and most notably?
African Americans, yes. There were all sorts of soldiers because, of course, most of the cities of Asia were R&R posts. And, this was the beginning of the transformation of Asian cities into dens of iniquity. This is when the prostitution started and the drug dealing and so on. Of course, most of the American troops were using drugs, and the R&R, Sydney was an R&R town, an approved R&R town. And so there were two Asias. There was the Asia of the Vietnam War, and there was the old Asia that was coming to terms with modernity, and it was, it was a time of great change, and people were very curious. People wanted answers to questions, so it was possible to have incredibly interesting conversations back then. And, you didn't have your resort outposts and resort towns then. They simply didn't exist. So I became very familiar with local forms of Buddhism, and...
It's the invisibility that fascinated me, that you felt that nobody was particularly noticing you, and this seemed to be a new experience. That was the...
Yeah. Well, this was the, still, I think, at the end of empire, when the British Empire was falling to bits, and there was still, as they used to call them, coolie gangs being transported around Asia. So, a third of Singapore was Indian. There were Indian tailors and Nepalese tailors in most of the cities. There were small, communities. So people assumed that I was either Indian or, something. They didn't know what, or maybe American. They hadn't really heard of Australia. Certainly Americans didn't know where Australia was. They were amazed that I could speak English. So, I was just somebody. I could have been anybody, because there were there's such an interesting history of all the Asian cities and so on. And I could just, so long as I could speak a few words of the local language, and, I ate with common people and shopped in ordinary places, I was just one of the locals.
And this was a new thing for you?
Totally new. It was absolutely wonderful because, I'd come out of Joby Elkie-Peterson's Queensland, where there was a very informal but very strict apartheid. You didn't get served, you had to wait at the back of the shop, maybe you couldn't be served at all. It was still the sort of the rule in Brisbane that, blacks didn't cross to the north side of the river. Unfortunately for all the white folks where I lived, it was the north side of the river. There'd been a long policy of keeping blacks on the south side of the river. And so, suddenly there was no apartheid, except to the extent that, you had the British in Hong Kong or, the American base or something like that. Wherever that happened to be, like Okinawa or, or the white, the clubs and restaurants for white Americans, especially for white officers. They would have security, MPs all around it. And they imported their whole no blacks allowed policy into Asia. So there were, black functions or clubs or whatever, and there were white functions and clubs in the R&R cities. Rest and recreation, that is, for those who are too young to know.
That was also the case in Queensland during the war, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yes. During the Second World War, as I understand it from all the older people, in fact, the river as the dividing line was established by General MacArthur's troops, and they kept all the black American troops on the south side of the river in Queensland, and there was a curfew, and if any black crossed the river at night, they were shot off the bridge. And so all the Aborigines had to live on the south side as well. So, that's how the, apartheid, the north-south apartheid in Queensland was established under General MacArthur.
If I remember, that actually created problems to the Australian Armed Forces because such Aboriginal members of the armed forces as there were integrated in effect, but with the arrival of the Americans at that time, they had to adjust to they had to conform to the American policy. So it, in fact, represented a big step backwards. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. Yes. And so to be in Asia, where everybody, is brown-skinned to one extent or another, and they have very complicated views of how the world works and who fits in where, and how. Who was baked long enough in heaven and who wasn't, and so on. And it kind of didn't matter, None of it mattered. And so suddenly I was in a world where there was absolutely no racism, and I didn't have to wonder, do I have to stand at the back of the shop here, or is this the kind of shop where I'm going to be served? Let me think, You know what I mean?
It must have been a wonderful
It was
revelation.
freedom, my first taste of freedom, Now, you too left Australia in some difficulty, and as I remember, it had to do with the armed hold-up squad in New South Wales.
Complicated story, as usual. I, in fact, left Australia twice. The first time my absence coincided, this was before we knew each other, exactly with the time that you were away. I left at the beginning of 1971 and came back at the beginning of 1975, exactly when you came back. That's when we met, if you remember.
Yes.
We had both just arrived back in Australia after several years away.
And you'd been in Finland and various parts of Europe.
Yes, and various other places, in different parts of Europe.
As an academic.
Part of the time, yes. Then there were those years that we had a lot to do with each other from about 75 to 78, and toward the end, I'm partly telling you things you probably know already, you probably remember, because we were mentioning them earlier. We were involved in putting out various papers. You put out Kuri Bina for the Aboriginal community, and I was editing a paper called Militant for the rather smaller community of the far left. And I was also partly financing Militant and financing myself by teaching English to migrants in Australia, and one of those places where I was doing it was Long Bay Jail. And when I was teaching at Long Bay, I got to know some of the prisoners quite well, I was seeing them several times a week, and I started hearing things. And I started hearing about certain activities of the armed hold-up squad and so on, and anyway, it was irresistible. It was improper, but absolutely irresistible. The idea of writing a series of articles based on the information that I had learned and illicitly taken out of the prison about the activities of specifically the armed hold-up squad and the New South Wales Police in general. This is back in the mid-70s, remember, before all the royal commissions, before the inquiries. The armed hold-up squad was led by a man who later became quite well known called Roger Rogerson. And he was the man who rugby tackled me in Darlinghurst courts one day. And he was, in the end, in this very complicated story, the reason why I left Australia the second time.
In a state of fear. And,
I think I dealt with the sort of practical problem, but it's slightly disturbing to find out that there is, especially when the agent of this is the police themselves, a contract out on your life. So it seemed quite a good idea. The people sort of joining us in our intimate conversation are all probably far too young, living in this, this demure and civilised global city that Sydney now is, to remember quite what Sydney was like back in the 70s, the Rann years, the violence, the corruption, the brutality. I don't think there was a Sydney Writers' Festival in the 1970s. Maybe there was. Anyway, that was the Sydney that I was leaving, and I must say I never really expected to come back at that point.
And so you wrote a series of articles, and I think I remember your pseudonym was Ross Edwards, is that right?
Yeah, Ross Edwards was the person the contract was out on. And unfortunately, my cover was blown when I was subpoenaed to be a defence witness at a bank robbery trial. That was when they realised who Ross Edwards was. And that, it was shortly after that I decided it would be politic to leave. You haven't really told us quite, apart from a vague reference to Joe Bielkovic's point, why you left Australia.
Well, it also has to do with, having a contract from the police out on me, so in Bielke-Peterson's Queensland. So I'm trying to remember the name of the police unit. I think it was called CID, Criminal Investigation Division, something like that. Anywho, they were pretty sure that myself and another Aboriginal person, a man, he's in fact the father of a famous footy player, Cockatoo. Anyway, look, I'm having trouble with the name, senior moment. He and I think were the first Aboriginal youngsters of that period to put out a leaflet. There'd been lots of old leaflets put out by the old people. They'd waged the campaign for a change to the Constitution and the repression on the reserves and so on. But we put out a leaflet in Brisbane about what was happening in Brisbane. And so we were both hunted down by the police, and they used to regularly trash my house. They'd come through and tear the house apart and threaten to kill me. So I went up and hid in Ipswich, out of all places, because I had a great uncle up there. And then I thought, well, there just aren't enough places to hide, so that's why I decided to go overseas.
Know the feeling.
So that's the kind of commonality that we have, and it's we didn't know that about each other, did we?
No.
I mean, I knew about you and
because that was a bit later. Yeah.
Roger Rogerson, and I'd never had a time to tell you about what had happened to me. And these things kind of slip your mind. After a while, you think, oh well, that's life. And of course, it happened again later in the Northern Territory when I was working for the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody, when the police one night kicked my hotel door in, I think they might have been sprung by staff or, rebellers returning home. So I thought somebody was trying to rob me, so I stupidly rang the police and said, somebody's kicked my hotel door in. And then after a while, after a bit of discussion, I realised, oh, I get it. But anyway, it's not something that either you or I have written about much, is it? You know, we don't, you know, it hasn't remained a part of our, you know, what we consider important in life. You know, there's kind of, you know, trials and tribulations. But I think what's more important is where we ended up and, you know, the cultural influences on our lives. And for me it was Asia, but for you it was Naples. So tell me about living in Naples for as long as you did, because you were away for a very, very long time.
It was never a plan. That time, you know, when I did leave Sydney at that time, my intention was to go to South America. It was all, you know, it was still those years, and I think I had some vague intention of joining a guerrilla movement or something. There was a group active in Venezuela that I'd read about in a French book, and I was quite interested. Or was it Colombia? I can't remember. It was either Venezuela or Colombia, or maybe both. And I was, you know, I had some notion that I might be able to make contact with them and contribute to the resistance to the dictatorships that were all over the continent in those days. But I had to decide how to get there, and the most convenient way seemed to be to go through Europe, you know, get a cheap flight to Europe and then find another cheap flight from Europe to South America. And I also quite wanted to see a bit more of Italy, particularly the south, which I'd really hardly more than glimpsed in that first period in Europe. And so I did all that. I got a plane to Rome, and then I sort of went south fairly slowly, did this sort of circuit, you know, went down to Naples and then on to Sicily and did a circuit of Sicily and then sort of worked back. And there was something about Naples, I don't know, it is such an extraordinary city. It's quite unlike any other I've ever been in before or since. And it was fascinating. It was a world, you know, it was a sort of self-enclosed world on its own. It was horrendous in many ways. Extremely poor, most of the people living there. But there was something quite captivating. It was so sui generis. You know, already by then, long before, even on my first time in Europe, you know, you could see that the Italy that people still have their romantic notions of was already largely gone. And that the only sort of remaining traces of the kind of authenticity that I was interested in were to be found south of Rome. You know, Sicily, Calabria, Puglia, Campania, and Naples is the greatest city of that region south of Rome. But it's a very strange city. It's very overpopulated in a small area because for many centuries people were not allowed to build outside the defensive walls. So it's grossly overcrowded. But also because of its sort of social and political isolation, it's very turned in on itself. And to sum up, Naples was a city where, for the first time anywhere in Europe, any time in my life, I felt a real glimpse into the past, into the ancient world. There was continuities in the way people lived, spoke, felt, behaved in general. This is an entirely subjective kind of thing, but I did feel I was in touch with the pre-industrial and indeed, even the ancient world in Naples.
And hence your fascination with Caravaggio? How did that come about?
Caravaggio I'd been interested since I was quite young. I just remember getting one of those volumes of the Pelican History of Art out of the library, and it was all in black and white. But I was fascinated then. But I certainly took advantage. And the crucial thing about Caravaggio is that most of the paintings that most people know are the ones in Rome and in the ones from that same Roman period that are scattered around. But in Naples and in Sicily, you encounter the post-Roman Caravaggio, who's in many ways a very different artist. Partly, his whole technique changes because he's on the run. He's killed a man in Rome, and he's being pursued both by the authorities and by enemies he makes along the way. He had a great capacity for making enemies. And so far from all the extraordinary optical experiments and innovations that he introduced in Rome when he was living in the palace of a patron who supplied him with everything he needed. He's having to work very, very fast, and he's having to work from memory, and he's having to work with a minimum of material assistance, temporary studios and stuff. And that is this urgent, dramatic, desperate late work of Caravaggio that you find on this, in all the places that he visited in his flight. First Naples, then Palermo, Messina, Syracuse, then down to Malta, where he had this extraordinary period and left, has still some of the most amazing paintings he did there. The post-Rome Caravaggio was very much a part of my experience of living in Naples and moving quite a lot around southern Italy.
So your you could call it a biography, I suppose, of sorts, of Caravaggio, captures the Caravaggio that the art world was not so interested in, but that's precisely the point, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, well, sort of, yes. That it was a book that took on a life of its own. It was meant to be. I always thought the bare facts, the external facts of his life were so extraordinary. There was no, in English, accessible account of these at the time that I first thought of writing about him. I originally just meant to write a sort of short and, hopefully dramatic and interesting account of his life. But, I very quickly got to the point where the question presented itself, and what are you going to do about the paintings? Are you going to just ignore them? No, you have to write about them too. And so, it became Also, I discovered there was all this stuff that I hadn't been aware of, that little scholars and archivists and things working all over Italy had dug up. None of it had been presented coherently. But my knowledge of Caravaggio turned out to be dramatically out of date. There was a massive new material, and the whole thing just became a completely absorbing task. It was a book that took on a life of its own and grew in the way it demanded to grow. It wasn't really under my control.
I've been in restaurants with you where I've seen the Italian restaurant staff line up at the door, each one holding a copy of Midnight in Sicily and holding it out. No, it's true.
No, it's not. That has never happened.
It happened in Surrey Hills. They were lined up at the door of the kitchen waiting for you to go to the toilet, and they were holding out their copies of Midnight in Sicily.
Look, I'm very gratified by it, and I wish it had happened.
It did,
but that
actually.
is a fantasy.
The question I'm getting around to is this: both in Midnight in Sicily and in Death in Brazil, I think that I was wondering if my thoughts about this were correct. Food is a big presence in both of those books, and I wonder if it's a good way to remember the place, or is it some kind of crutch that you hold on, and is it some kind of writer's device? The food of Bahia and so on, and it crops up frequently. We know the cafe that you're in, and we know what you're going to have for lunch, and who owns the restaurant, and so on. And it does carry in the case of Death in Brazil, a pretty a political adventure along in a nice way. What's the thing with food in your writing?
On one level, it's just an unscrupulous use of a technique. When I was writing the first book, Midnight in Sicily, I took a couple of chapters, the first couple of chapters, along to Michael Duffy to see if this was the kind of thing that might make a book. And he urged me to go ahead, and he said, I particularly like the stuff about the market in Palermo. Put in some more stuff about food. People like reading about food. So in that sense, I was just shamelessly pandering to a presumed market. But in fact, I wrote about that market, and I wrote the other stuff about food because I realized more as the years passed. I had a very fortunate childhood in that sense, in that my mother was a fabulous cook, and a much more various cook than most people were in those days, and our whole family was always intensely interested in food. I remember when we were small and our parents would go out to dinner, and the next day, us kids always interrogated them closely about what exactly they'd had to eat. And stuff. And for example, I remember when Rupert Murdoch dropped into dinner unannounced once, he got a very good dinner. Tuna rossini with sautéed potatoes and a few mushrooms and very nice salad, I remember. I don't know if Rupert remembers it, but I do. So, it is genuine in that way.
But it also is a great way to put the scalpel into the culture that you're living in at the time, isn't it?
That's true. I do profoundly believe that, and that's the only interesting side of it these days to me is, and it's diminishing, of course, because regional habits and regional cooking and regional eating and seasonal local produce and stuff, apart from to the extent to which it's been revived by intellectuals of the kitchen and so on, it's disappearing. But still somewhere, and especially in industrially backward places like southern Italy and like Brazil and so on, you still get people following local traditions and local habits and just what's available locally, cheaply. And so you're quite right. I mean, I do profoundly believe that. It affords a profound insight into the life and the culture of the place that you're in, what you eat. There's another aspect, of course, is, as you will well know from your Asian thing, Asian years, one travels around, you're always eating out because you're never at home anywhere. Mm-hmm. And another thing I love about restaurants, particularly certain ones, always cheap ones, is that they afford you a kind of theatre, the local life of the theatre. The theatre of the local life, I meant to say.
Yes.
So you sit, you're on your own because you're a lone traveller. You find a good inconspicuous place in the corner and you watch. And of course, in Italy and indeed Brazil, this more than most places, you watch the theatre of the local life being played out while you eat your meal. It's a wonderful vantage point.
Well, I've been on a 12-year journey with a food stuff. It's called tree pang. It's a sea slug, which Chinese people eat. And a Chinese friend and I turned it into a major art exhibition, which just opened in Beijing.
This was the one that you've just come back from in Beijing.
Yeah, and a beautiful catalogue, and it's opening in Melbourne in July.
Can you tell me a bit about that? You've told me about being in Beijing for this exhibition, but you haven't told me much about what the exhibition actually consists of.
Well, Xiaoping is a very interesting Chinese artist that I've known for about 15 years. And 12 years ago, we started collaborating on this project. First of all, started talking. He came around to lunch in Darwin one day. And, of course, I've always eaten Asian food. In fact, I'm allergic to most everything else now with late onset, gluten intolerance and lactose intolerance. And so, Asian food suits me very well and, we have our own ways of cooking at home. So I had all the sort of cans of Chinese foodstuffs, like corn and mushrooms. And so I cooked some rice and Xiaoping was amazed. He said, I eat like this at home. Why do you eat like this? Why you eat like this? And so we just started talking about food. And I said, did you know that the Macassan people from what is now Sulawesi used to come to Australia and collect the tree pang and take it back to China, which is what you Chinese people eat? Tree pang, what tree pang? So I drew him a picture of a tree pang. Oh, yes. And he speaks English much better now, of course, but that's when and he had been living in Arnhem Land with an old Aboriginal artist. In fact, when he got to Australia, he discovered Aboriginal people by doing a bus tour around Australia, and he ended up living with the late Jimmy Pike and with the late Johnny Bullen, who was the collaborator on this project for the last 12 years. He passed away last year before we could get it up. But his widow and son came to the opening in Beijing, so the show now is kind of in honour of him. And so Mr. Bullen knew a great deal he learnt the oral histories of the Macassans coming to Arnhem Land, and so he and Xiaoping did painting stories together and separately, and it just kind of grew over the years, and we ended up getting sponsors, and now it's a travelling exhibition.
And we will see it here?
In Melbourne, actually, at the Melbourne Museum in July. Okay. Yeah, and it's about Treepang, and I wrote the essay and kind of hung in there, you know, and found things. We found an ancient Chinese map, for instance, and a series of maps, and I would have liked to have been able to use them all. But the Chinese, of course, were great mercantile adventurers and mapping the world, and they knew about Australia hundreds of years ago. And it looks like there's a lot more to the story than, you know, Australian historians have ever been aware.
In terms of contact between China and Australia?
The northern coasts of Australia, that kind of very busy marine area to the north of Australia where you had the Portuguese, the Dutch, Indian traders, you know. It was so it was always kind of represented as a, you know, nothing ever happened there according to the British, right? Well, that was because they came very much later than everybody else and, you know, didn't do very much really, you know. But, you know, it was Matthew Flinders who ran into one of these huge Macassan fleets with about 1,000 prow, led by Captain Pabasu, and Flinders notes that all the men had kris, you know, the swords, and there were and Flinders' cook could speak Malay, and so the encounters all written down in Flinders' journal. So we have that part of Flinders' journal in the exhibition, for instance, So we were treated to a big banquet in Beijing, which included treepang, which of course Aboriginal people don't eat, and we're kind of all, you know, there were these squiggly black things in bowls of soup, and we all had to pretend that we liked it and, you know, eat a little bit and, oh, very nice. It tastes weird.
Well, I'm glad you did try it, though.
Yeah. So...
no, I want to ask you something.
Okay.
And that is, Here Comes the Nigger. Does anybody remember Here Comes the Nigger?
No, we're all too young.
It was a play that Marcia was in at the Black Theatre in Redfern in it was about 77, was it? 76 or 7.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this. We were talking about some people we'd known, some of whom are unfortunately no longer alive, around that wonderful moment and experience of the Black Theatre that I have, you know, brief but wonderful memories of, and its extraordinary role in the artistic life of Sydney at that time, and not just in Aboriginal milieus, but in the larger cultural milieu of Australia at that time, this extraordinary phenomenon of the Black Theatre. It didn't last very long, and you were involved at different points in things they did. Can you remind us of a few things? After our conversation, I was thinking, you know, a lot of stuff came back to me, but some of it was vague, and some things, because that happened before I came back to Australia, I had never known. Can you fill us in on that? I just found it very gripping and very moving to go back and recall the dynamism and the centrality of that Aboriginal cultural enterprise and its extraordinary importance.
Yes. Here Comes the Nigger was written by Jerry Bostock, and his brother Lester had set up Black Theatre. But actually there were people around before Lester, and I can't remember their names, I'm sorry. They're all dead now. They've been dead for years. But they set up...
Betty?
Yes, Betty. Betty.
What was her surname? She ran it.
It was Betty. Yes, it was Betty. Betty who set it up.
She had been a jazz singer.
She'd been a jazz singer.
She died quite young.
She died young.
Indeed, I think that might have been what was the beginning of the end for the Black Theatre. I've never really understood why it all abruptly finished after a few years of extraordinary, productive...
Well, because, look, it ended because, Aboriginal matters were being taken up by the bureaucracy, and, a bureaucracy was being formed in Canberra, and, what a bunch of, outsider... comedians and artists and so on were doing in Redfern was of absolutely no concern to any government, and so they cut off all our funding.
Is this what it's all about, that it belongs to the pre-bureaucratic phase of the Aboriginal struggle?
Yes.
Kent Embassy, all that, part of that moment?
It's pre-bureaucratic.
And the bureaucracy and the bureaucratisation of the black movement drowned it. Is that what happened?
Yeah. It was raw theatre and it was raw comedy, and nobody had ever seen anything like it. There was briefly a program on ABC television from Black Theatre in Redfern about a character called Superbung. And, and so it was pre-political correctness, none of the, you can't say black theatre today, you can't say the word black, you couldn't possibly have Superbung today, it wouldn't be permitted, So Superbung was Gary Williams, and he had a cloak, and he'd come out of an old red telephone booth and put on his cloak, and, this was, before barbecue area and so on. Then this was crazy black comedy from the streets. So, and saying and doing things just to be completely outrageous, So using words like nigger, here comes the nigger.
Can I ask you a question about that? I have an admission to make that I've never made to you. I never saw Here Comes the Nigger. On entirely principled grounds, I have to tell you, because I disapproved of the title. not because of political correctness, but I thought it showed undue influence of American culture. And for that, I did see The Cake Man, but I never saw Here Comes the Nigger. Can you tell us about it?
Well, I'll tell you some of the most interesting bits of it. Basically, it's a young black man, his mate's a white man, but his mate's a bit racist, and he's got an even more racist mate, and then there's conflict, and it all takes place, in Redfern. There's an Aboriginal setting, and I'm, can't remember really my role. I think I'm the receptionist at the Aboriginal Medical Service or something. In any case, there's a fabulous fight scene which was choreographed by Brian Brown. And it sounds like the boots are really hitting the head and so on. And in those days, Aboriginal people weren't familiar with live theatre. And it was, in the round, and all the old ladies would come with their umbrellas, and they hated the word nigger too. They thought it was terrible, so they were going to show up with their umbrellas and, make a point. And the fight scene would start, and they would climb the fence and come over and hit the actors. You get off him! Get off him! You missed a great time. It was wonderful. And then eventually they got used to the idea of live theatre, and, and then we started having, the early dances there. Naysda, what became Naysda and Bangara, that all start, they had some of their performances at the old Black Theatre. Quite a lot of comedy came out of there, actually. So,
yes. Well, there was that cabaret thing that the ABC took up at one point. I think it was on... the ABC screened it for a while, that started at the Black Theatre.
Yeah, and all the auditions for those films, something about a wave... it's set in the sewers of Sydney.
Oh, the Peter Weir film.
The Peter Weir film.
Yeah, The Last Wave.
The Last Wave. That was all. They recruited and cast at Black Theatre, and also there was an ABC television series called Pig and a Poke.
Yeah.
And so one episode of that is set in Redfern, and again all cast from Redfern. I was in that. Yeah.
There's something else that was really wonderful about the Black Theatre, I thought, at that time. And it's something that is hard to recapture now, because these other things you can remember in terms of productions and when they were on and who was in them, and there's a certain record there. But there was something else about that theatre and the way it became a very dynamic kind of social centre at the same time, and all people who were not necessarily doing anything in the theatre used to come in and hang around, some quite old people I remember, and I also remember some very young Aboriginal children being there, and often, rehearsals would be going on the stage, and these other people were just sort of quietly sitting around watching or doing something else, using the, a theatre has facilities, the scenery and all this. And it was something about that, it was a theatre, but it was also more than a theatre. It was a wonderful cultural centre.
It
and
was
yet
indeed.
Its life was so short.
Yes. But you're wrong about the word nigger. It wasn't from an American influence at all. In fact, it was very widely used here in Australia in the 19th century, and you'll find it in all the old newspapers. And, in fact, it was pretty common amongst the police. Indeed.
Indeed,
Yeah.
much later too.
Yeah. And so, we used to have, because Black Theatre was a centre, we had actually a daily bail fund for cast and crew. And so we'd all be standing there, at the curtains, behind the curtains, where's Kevin, where's Marcia? And then, at 10:02, we'd say, Lester, call the station. So he'd call and see who was in there and go up with the bail fund and pay and get them out just in time to start the show. So we have this commonality that I never ever expected that, would be a part of our lives. So you with Roger Rogerson and me with the CID in Queensland, how interesting.
But did you ever imagine that in 1975, say, that we would be sitting here now?
No.
It seems very strange,
No.
don't you think?
No. I think both of us might have had the view back then we'd be lucky to be alive within a few months. But it was pretty scary. You were followed, right?
Yes. Well, I was followed after the trial. After I got thrown out of the court.
Yeah.
Because I refused to answer some questions on the grounds that it might endanger me. And as I left the courts at Darlinghurst, this sort of unmarked car pulled out, a beige car. I didn't even particularly notice it from the other side of the road. And I was walking home. I lived in East Sydney at that time, if you remember, in Stanley Street. I was
down
walking
the road from the police station.
Yes, indeed. So I walked, past the Darlinghurst, the no longer existing Darlinghurst police station, down Oxford Street. And I suddenly noticed this car, it was still... There was a car moving very, very slowly down Oxford Street, and something about it caught my eye. I think just the slowness with which it was travelling compared with the rest of the traffic. I suddenly realised it was the same car that I'd just seen pulling out from opposite the court when I walked out. And so I had my eye on it, and it pulled up for a moment by the footpath, and one of the people in it got out, and he went into a shop doorway. And then I realised, I saw he was taking photographs of me across Oxford Street, and that was when I got really scared. And it was later that evening, in fact, that a journalist, a Fairfax journalist, told me that they understood that there was a contract out on Ross Edwards. It was creepy. It was terrible things happened in the Sydney at that time, didn't they? It was not. These were not irrational fears. People disappeared. People.
The same used to happen in Queensland.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's also different now. We're all so civilised.
Well, I was getting around to asking you about that. So you've been back in Australia for a long time, and so have I, and we remember those days very clearly. Those memories are very sharp, aren't they? Mm. And now it's almost inconceivable that a writer or a journalist or, even a community journalist, as we were, we were community journalists, weren't we? And, we were in the arts, that people could be persecuted like that today. It's almost inconceivable, isn't it, that you'd have the police following you, that you'd have contract out on you. Yeah. And it's a completely different world that we live in now, isn't it, here in Australia?
We live in the world of bureaucracy and legislation and political correctness, and at least on the surface, everything is much more civilised. One is only half joking when one says that. But I don't know about you, but I feel it's a rather brittle or a rather superficial kind of civilization. There are all sorts of things still seething away underneath. On a domestic level, you get these extraordinary and horrendous explosions of violence, which, I think they suggest something is not entirely well in our apparently very well-ordered society. It just manifests itself in different ways. That's my feeling about it. I don't think now is all that different from then underneath. It's managed somewhat, but the basic problems are still there, I think.
Yeah, so nowadays you wouldn't get a promotion, or you wouldn't get the job, or people gossip about you, and gossip can be just as harmful as actual violence, can't it? And, and there are sort of elites who have a, very civilised form of social thuggery that they exercise and that sort of thing, right? So, and it was all so much raw and, physical back then, wasn't it? Yeah.
Whereas one of the main we're talking about the way we were both involved in fringe political activities then. One of the extraordinary differences between then and now is the extent to which all of life has become completely depoliticized. There is no discussion about ends and means. I mean, the implosion or the shrivelling away or something of the Labour Party is one sign of that.
Yes.
The Labour Party, one of the great social political movements in Australian history, is just kind of drifting away into complete insignificance. And this, of course, is not just an Australian thing. It's happening with social democratic politics in all of the Western societies. It's not by any means particularly Australian. It's something, it's one of the really disturbing things that's happening in the rich countries, the rich industrial or post-industrial societies of the West, I think. And which means that the most important things never get talked about anymore. There is also this, this dreadful cage of political correctness that inhibits the terms in which you can discuss something. That's what I feel.
I'm very loath to interrupt this conversation because I have a palpable sense that 40 years of friendship distilled into 45 minutes is an impossible task. But this is that brief moment where the civilised veneer can crack and we can see some social thuggery. It's a chance for you to ask a question or two. We don't have very long. Please put your hand up, keep it brief. There are microphones.
I wanted to say, Auntie Marcia, could you feel a pan-Aboriginal or perhaps pan-Indian revolution is blowing in the wind, comprised of a pan-Aboriginal alliance that share one thing in common? What do Irish and Welsh Aboriginals, Australian Aboriginals, Native Indians and Indians from the subcontinent have in common? All these sovereign peoples have all been occupied by the same two Germanic barbarian tribes, those rascals, the Angles and the Saxons, who are originally from northern Germany. Could there possibly be a new pan-Aboriginal charismatic guerrilla leader in our midst? I thought you're also welcome to join.
Oh, thanks.
Just before you answer, that might be a demonstration of speaking fast sometimes doesn't make a question short. So if we could keep it pithier so that we can hear a tiny bit more. Marcia?
There's an intellectual movement that's now about, 30 years old, called post-colonialism. And I've been long interested in post-colonialism. I've been to India a number of times and I've met post-colonial writers, both the intellectuals, the novelists and so on. I love the work of Ashish Nandi. And I think there's a much more humanist and historically precise way of talking about all of these matters, and you'll find it in the post-colonial literature. I love the work of Amitav Ghosh, Arundhati Roy, and I could go on and on with all of those authors. And, there are a number of great Aboriginal writers, Scott, who's here now, author of Benang and another book, and, highly awarded. Well, I think, the pan-Aboriginality thing is just, it's a bit like, the Black Panther movement. It had its moment, but it's not terribly helpful, really, because people are, living human beings who eat particular foods and they grew up in particular places with particular kinds of dogs and trees and, with houses painted a certain colour. Pan-Aboriginality doesn't tell us very much. What is more important, I think, is, how people think about that, that great burden of colonial history. And I think it's great intellectuals and great writers who tell us the most about that. And I don't think Australia has been very, a very important part of that movement. And I think it's precisely because of this problem that Peter just raised, and that is political correctness. So there's kind of the dead hand of political correctness stops us from talking about these matters. I think we've got a long way to go yet. Australia has a lot of maturing to do in relation to that, into that problem, as do Indians, and the nationalist movements, the Hindu nationalist movements in India are arguably a lot more dangerous than, political correctness in Australia. But I think that, the post-colonial literature all over the world has, I think, given us a great way of understanding that. You could argue that there is, some very good Irish post-colonial literature, but they don't call it that.
Apropos of that, I've got very little to add, but there is just one little thought that I would add to the last thing I said about how little, in some ways, things have changed, and that is the great vigour and energy and commitment of the Aboriginal movement in Australia, and the remarkable contributions that all sorts of groups from other places and other cultures have brought to this country. It's still, given all that, and given the pro forma recognition of let's say, multicultural identity, it still amazes me quite how sort of white and Anglo-Australian culture remains after at least half a century of sort of really intensive activity on the cultural front. Doesn't seem to me to be all that multicultural a society yet. I think that's another sense in which things haven't changed all that much.
Well, I think there's something to be said, and it's terribly politically incorrect to say it, and that is that, if you're on a good thing, stick to it. And the Anglos in Australia have managed to, pull off a pretty nice way of life, and why would they chuck it in for anything else?
Well, that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about cultural power or something. The institutions,
great wealth,
government, industrial, media,
yes,
etc. They're all in the same
political stability.
They're all in the hands of the same people.
That's right.
Still,
that's right. Well, why would they give any of that up? Political stability, but also it's a pretty nice way of life. The Sydney Writers' Festival is part of that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, you don't have to like Dame Edna Everage particularly to get it, I mean, yes, we come from that generation of, people who became expatriates and went away to write, but still they remain very Anglo. I mean, Germaine might have a house in Tuscany, but she's still bunkered in Warwick, isn't she?
Look, I'm going to ask you, I know you're busting with other questions. I'm afraid we're plumb out of time, somewhat unsurprisingly. And the Sydney Writers' Festival doesn't have a daily bail fund, which is a crying shame. So we have to let them out. Please join me in thanking Peter Robb and Marcia.